Ernest Anderson came home unannounced that December afternoon and heard music playing in his house. He froze. For 3 years, his home in Denver had been silent. His 2 autistic daughters hadn't spoken, hadn't laughed, hadn't made a sound. So where was that music coming from? His heart pounded as he moved toward the living room. Then he heard it. Child laughter, bright and real. When he opened the door, what he saw stopped him cold. Ernest hadn't planned to come home early that day. For 3 years, he'd avoided his house like it was cursed. His wife, Catherine, had died in a car accident when their twin daughters, Ella and Lily, were only 3. The girls had been making small progress with their autism before the tragedy. A few words, brief eye contact, tiny smiles. After Catherine died, they disappeared completely. They stopped speaking, stopped looking at anyone, wouldn't let him touch them. Ernest spent over $2 million trying to reach them, 15 specialists over 3 years, behavioral therapy, speech therapy. Nothing worked. 6 weeks ago, he hired Melinda Brown to manage the house, 29 years old, quiet, efficient. She cleaned, cooked, and stayed out of the way. Ernest barely noticed her. That Tuesday, his meeting ended early. He drove home. When he stepped inside, he heard music playing. Soft, classical. His pulse raced. The house had been silent for 3 years. Then he heard laughter. High-pitched, real. His daughters. He hadn't heard them laugh since the morning Catherine made them breakfast, hours before she died. Ernest reached the living room door and pushed it open. What he saw made the world stop. Melinda stood in the center of the room, arms raised, moving like water, and on either side of her, wearing pink tutus, were Ella and Lily, dancing, their faces glowing with pure joy. They were fully present, alive in a way he hadn't seen in 3 years. His briefcase hit the floor. 3 heads turned. Then Ella did something impossible. She looked directly at him, held his gaze, and reached one small hand toward him. Ernest dropped to his knees. For the first time in 3 years, when he reached for his daughters, they didn't pull away. When the music stopped, he looked up at Melinda, tears streaming down his face. "How?" he whispered. Melinda knelt beside them. "They were never unreachable, Mr. Anderson. They just needed someone willing to meet them where they are." Ernest stared at her. 15 specialists had failed, and this woman, a maid he barely knew, had done the impossible in 6 weeks. What he didn't know was that Melinda had a past, a calling she'd walked away from, and God had been quietly preparing her for this exact moment. Before we continue, like this video, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Because sometimes God puts the right person in your life exactly when you need them most. Ernest didn't say a word about what he'd seen. He just started coming home earlier. First an hour early, then 2. By the end of the week, he was leaving the office by noon, making excuses his assistant stopped questioning. He'd slip into the house quietly and watch from doorways, from the kitchen, from the top of the stairs. Always careful, always hidden. What he saw broke him in ways he didn't know were possible. Melinda wasn't doing therapy. She was just living with them, humming while she folded laundry, her body swaying gently. And Lily, who hadn't responded to anything in 3 years, would stop rocking and watch her, actually watch her. When Melinda set the table, she'd place each item down with rhythm, plate, fork, cup, napkin. And across the room, Ella would move her hands in the same pattern, like she was learning a song without words. Everything Melinda did had a pulse to it, a gentleness Ernest had forgotten could exist. One afternoon, he watched her dress the girls. For 3 years, getting them dressed had meant meltdowns and screaming. Melinda held up a shirt and swayed it softly, humming. Ella reached for it, not because she was told to, because the movement invited her. Melinda guided her arms through the sleeves in time with the rhythm, slow, steady, like water. No tears, no fight, just peace. Ernest's chest tightened. Catherine used to move like that, used to sway the girls to sleep, bounce them on her hip, hum made-up songs. She'd understood something he never had, that they didn't need fixing. They needed to be met where they were, and Melinda was doing exactly that. Then, one Thursday afternoon, something happened that made Ernest forget how to breathe. Melinda stood in the living room and raised her arms slowly, palms up, like she was lifting something invisible. She did it once, twice, a third time. And Lily, who hadn't imitated anyone in 3 years, lifted her arms too, slowly, deliberately, mirroring her. Ernest's hand froze on his laptop. His throat burned. He wanted to shout, to cry, to run into that room and thank Melinda for giving him back something he thought was gone forever. But he didn't move. He just sat there, watching this woman unlock his daughters with nothing but presence and rhythm. And that's when the question hit him like a fist to the chest. How did she know? How did a maid, someone with no credentials, no training that he knew of, understand his daughters better than 15 specialists? Better than him? Ernest stared at Melinda as she guided the girls into another gentle movement. There was something in the way she moved, something trained, something she wasn't telling him, and he needed to know what it was. That night, after the girls were asleep, Ernest made a decision. He was going to ask her. He was going to find out who Melinda Brown really was, because the woman cleaning his house was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had just brought his daughters back to life. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Ernest found Melinda in the kitchen wiping down the counters. "Melinda," his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Can you stay a moment, please?" She turned, her eyes widening slightly. In 3 years of employing various staff, Ernest had never asked anyone to stay after hours, never had a real conversation beyond scheduling and instructions. "Of course, Mr. Anderson." She set down the cloth, her hands folding neatly in front of her. He gestured to the small table by the window. "Sit, please." They sat across from each other in the dim kitchen light, and for a long moment, Ernest didn't know how to start. How do you ask someone to explain a miracle? "Where did you learn it?" he finally said. "What you do with them, the way you move, the way you reach them." Melinda's face went very still. She looked down at her hands. "I don't mean to overstep by asking," Ernest continued quickly. I need to understand. 15 specialists over 3 years couldn't do what you've done in 6 weeks. Mr. Anderson?" "Ernest, please." She looked up at him then, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't noticed before. Pain. Deep, old pain that mirrored his own. "I wasn't always a maid," she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. "I worked as a dance and movement therapist for 3 years. Children with special needs, mostly on the autism spectrum. I specialized in nonverbal communication." She paused, her jaw tightening. "I was good at it. Really good. Until I wasn't." Ernest leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What happened?" "Burnout." The word came out like a confession. "I took every failure personally. Every child I couldn't reach felt like I'd failed them. After 3 years, I just broke. I walked away 2 years ago and took domestic jobs to heal, to step away from the weight of it all." Ernest felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "You're a trained therapist." "Was," she corrected softly. "I gave up my license. I'm not practicing anymore." "But you saw it. From the first day, you knew what Ella and Lily needed." Melinda nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I saw it immediately. The way they moved, the way they retreated. I knew traditional verbal approaches would keep failing them, but I was terrified to say anything. Who would believe the maid?" Ernest's hands clenched on the table, not from anger at her, from rage at himself. "I've been paying you minimum wage to clean floors while you've been doing what I paid specialists 6 figures to fail at." "Mr. Anderson," "Ernest," his voice cracked. "You gave me back my daughters, Melinda, and you did it thinking you had to hide who you really are because I was too blind to see you." She looked away, a tear sliding down her cheek. "Teach me," Ernest said suddenly. "Teach me how to reach them, how to be present with them the way you are." Melinda met his eyes. "It's not about technique, Ernest. It's about showing up, being patient, meeting them in their world instead of dragging them into ours." Then teach me that, he said, because I've been absent for 3 years, and I'm ready to come home. Melinda studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Okay. But there was something else in her expression, something uncertain, like she was opening a door she'd spent 2 years keeping locked, and Ernest had no idea that inviting her deeper into their lives meant she'd eventually have to face the very thing that had broken her in the first place. A week later, Melinda found something that would change everything. Ernest had finally given her the key to Catherine's office, a room he'd kept locked for 3 years. Just do what you need to do, he'd said, his voice barely steady. Melinda worked carefully, treating everything like it was sacred. Catherine's books, her ballet slippers on the shelf, photos of her dancing before everything got harder. Then she opened the closet. Behind Catherine's wedding dress, she found a box, unmarked, dusty. Inside were dozens of small drives, each one labeled in Catherine's handwriting with dates, some from when she was pregnant, others from when the girls were babies. The last one dated 2 days before the accident. Melinda carried the box downstairs with shaking hands. Ernest was in the kitchen, staring at his coffee. When she set the box in front of him, his face went white. I found these in her office, Melinda said quietly. I think you need to see them. Ernest stared at his wife's handwriting like it might shatter him. Will you stay? He whispered. I can't do this alone. Melinda sat beside him. Ernest plugged in the first drive. The screen flickered. Catherine appeared, pregnant, sitting in her office. She looked tired but radiant. My sweet girls, she said to the camera, if you're watching this, it means Mama isn't there to tell you herself. I know words are hard for you. So I'm recording these, my voice, my movements, my songs. So someday, even if I can't be there, you'll still have me. The video showed Catherine singing lullabies, dancing slowly, moving with the same grace Melinda had been using with the girls. Ernest's hands trembled as he opened video after video. Catherine had known. Somehow, she'd known her daughters would need this. Then he opened the final file. 2 days before the accident. Catherine looked directly into the camera, her voice steady and fierce. Ernest, if something happens to me, don't let the girls stop moving. Movement is their language. Find someone who understands that. Don't let grief freeze them. The video ended. Ernest stared at the blank screen. Then he broke. Completely. He dropped his head into his hands and sobbed, raw, unguarded sobs from a place he'd kept buried for 3 years. Melinda said nothing. She just placed her hand gently on his shoulder. When Ernest finally looked up, his face was wet, his eyes red. She knew, he whispered, and I locked it all away. You were grieving, Melinda said softly. You did what you could. Ernest shook his head. She left me a roadmap, and God sent you to help me follow it. He looked at Melinda, his jaw tight with new resolve. Will you help me use these videos with the girls? Let them hear their mother again. Melinda nodded. Every day. But as Ernest held that final drive, neither of them knew that bringing Catherine's voice back would unlock something they weren't prepared for. Something that would prove Catherine had been right about everything. 2 weeks after finding Catherine's videos, something happened that Ernest would remember for the rest of his life. They'd started incorporating Catherine's recordings into the daily sessions. Her voice filled the house again, soft, warm, alive. At first, Ernest worried it would break the girls, hearing their mother would send them spiraling back into darkness, but it didn't. Instead, Ella and Lily responded to Catherine's voice like flowers turning toward sunlight. They moved more freely, smiled more often. It was like some part of them remembered, even after 3 years of silence. That afternoon, all 3 of them were in the living room. Catherine's lullaby played softly, the one she used to sing when the girls were babies. Melinda guided them through gentle movements, her arms raised, the girls mirroring her. Ernest had started joining the sessions, not leading, just being there. Present, learning to exist in their world instead of dragging them into his. Midway through the routine, Lily suddenly stopped moving. Everyone froze. Ernest's heart dropped. Was she regressing? Was this too much? Lily stood completely still, staring at Melinda. Then, clear as daylight, she said one word. Again? The room went silent except for Catherine's voice still playing in the background. Ernest gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. Melinda's eyes filled with tears, but she kept her face calm, steady. Again? Melinda said gently. You want to do it again, sweetheart? Lily nodded, deliberately, purposefully. Then she said it again. Again. Ernest couldn't breathe. His daughter, his baby girl who hadn't spoken in 3 years, had just said a word, a real word, with meaning, with intention. Melinda raised her arms slowly, starting the movement over. This time, Lily mouthed the words silently as they moved, her lips forming it carefully. Again. When the movement ended, Lily looked at her father, really looked at him, and said something that shattered what was left of Ernest's heart. Mama singing. 2 words, full meaning. His daughter was speaking. Ernest dropped to his knees, trembling. He wanted to scream, to cry, to hold her and never let go. But he stayed still, terrified of breaking the moment. Lily walked over to him, walked, not shuffled, and placed her small hand on his cheek. Mama singing, she said again. We dance. Ernest pulled her close, and for the first time in 3 years, Lily wrapped her arms around his neck. Ella moved closer too, pressing herself against his side. Melinda knelt beside them, tears streaming down her face. Ernest looked at her, his voice breaking. She spoke. Melinda nodded, smiling through her tears. She did. That night, after the girls were asleep, Ernest sat in his office staring at his phone. He'd recorded the moment, Lily's voice saying, again, captured forever. He should have been celebrating, shouting from the rooftops, calling everyone he knew. But instead, a dark thought crept into his mind. What if someone tried to take this away? What if someone decided Melinda's methods were dangerous, unproven? He thought of Dr. Morrison, the lead behavioral therapist he'd paid $180,000 over 3 years, the one who'd told him nonverbal regression was likely permanent. She didn't know about Lily's breakthrough yet, but when she found out, what would she say? Ernest stared at Melinda's number in his phone. She'd given him everything, but he'd never told her she was more than staff, never told her she was family. And that silence might cost him everything, because the world didn't always celebrate miracles. Sometimes it questioned them. Dr. Morrison showed up unannounced 3 days after Lily spoke her first words. Ernest had made the mistake of sending her a video. Subject line: she spoke. He'd been too excited to think clearly, too grateful to consider the consequences. Dr. Morrison didn't congratulate him. She demanded to observe Melinda's methods in person. Ernest tried to say no. But 3 years of conditioning, 3 years of trusting credentials over instinct, made him agree. That afternoon, Dr. Morrison sat in the corner of the living room, her face unreadable as she watched. Melinda guided Ella and Lily through their routine. Catherine's voice played softly. The girls moved with focus, with joy. Lily used her new words. Again, more, Mama singing. Ella showed clear engagement, her eyes bright and present. To anyone else, it would have looked like a miracle. Dr. Morrison saw something different. After the session, she pulled Ernest into the hallway, her expression severe. Mr. Anderson, what I just witnessed is dangerous. Ernest blinked. Dangerous? My daughter is speaking again. Unregulated methodology, Dr. Morrison said sharply. Movement therapy without proper clinical oversight. This woman has no active license, no accountability. What she's doing is pseudoscience masquerading as treatment. Ernest's jaw tightened. It's working. Is it? Dr. Morrison's voice dropped. Or is your daughter simply parroting sounds? Echolalia is common in autism. This could be meaningless repetition, not true communication. And encouraging it without proper assessment could cause regression worse than before. Ernest felt his stomach turn. You're saying she's not really speaking? I'm saying you're gambling with your daughter's futures. Dr. Morrison glanced toward the living room where Melinda was cleaning up. That woman is playing therapist without credentials. I have an ethical obligation to report this to Child Protective Services. The words hit Ernest like ice water. You're threatening to call CPS? I'm protecting your children from harm. Dr. Morrison's face softened slightly. Ernest, I understand you're desperate, but you've invested 3 years in evidence-based approaches. Don't throw that away for unproven methods delivered by domestic staff. Ernest stood there, caught between two realities. Dr. Morrison represented everything he'd been taught to trust: degrees, institutions, clinical distance. She'd taken $180,000 of his money over 3 years and produced nothing but reports and cautious prognoses. Then he thought of Melinda. No credentials on his payroll, just presence, just patience, just 3 years of training she'd walked away from because she cared too much, and his daughters, actually present, actually responding, actually alive for the first time since Catherine died. Ernest looked Dr. Morrison in the eye. You had 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years and $2 million. You gave me charts and clinical assessments, but you never gave me hope. Mr. Anderson, Melinda gave me my daughters back in 6 weeks. His voice was steady now, certain. She learned their language. You tried to force them to learn yours. Dr. Morrison's face hardened. You're making a mistake. Then it's mine to make. Ernest moved toward the door, opening it. We're done here, Dr. Morrison. Send whatever reports you need to send, but you're not coming back into my house. She stared at him, stunned. Then she gathered her things and left without another word. Ernest stood in the empty hallway, his heart pounding. He'd just chosen an unlicensed maid over a board-certified specialist. He'd just bet everything on something he couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. And he had no idea if he'd just saved his daughters or destroyed them. From the living room, he heard Lily's voice. Daddy, come. His daughter. Calling him. With words. Ernest walked back into the room where Melinda stood with both girls, uncertainty written across her face. She'd heard everything. Is everything okay? She asked quietly. Ernest knelt beside his daughters. Everything's perfect. But the look in Melinda's eyes told him she didn't believe it. And deep down, Ernest knew the truth. Dr. Morrison wasn't done, and the battle for his daughter's future had just begun. 3 days after Dr. Morrison's visit, Ernest found Melinda packing. He'd come home early, as usual. But instead of finding her in the living room with the girls, he heard movement upstairs. When he reached her room in the guest wing, the door was open. Her belongings were in boxes. Ernest's chest tightened. What are you doing? Melinda didn't turn around. I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice, Mr. Anderson. The formal title hit him like a slap. She hadn't called him that since the night they watched Catherine's videos. Why? His voice came out rougher than he intended. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were red. My sister runs a cleaning company in Philadelphia. She offered me a supervisor position, better pay, less complicated. Complicated? Ernest stepped into the room. Melinda, what's this really about? She set down the sweater she'd been folding, her hands trembling. I overstepped. I'm not their mother. I'm not their therapist. I'm just the maid. And after what Dr. Morrison said, Dr. Morrison is wrong. Is she? Melinda's voice cracked. What if she's right? What if I'm doing more harm than good? What if Lily's words don't mean anything? What if I've been playing pretend this whole time and I'm too blind to see it? Ernest stared at her. You don't believe that? I don't know what I believe anymore. Tears spilled down her cheeks. But I know I can't be the reason someone calls CPS on you. I can't be the reason you lose your daughters. You're the reason I have them back. Melinda shook her head. I'm staff, Ernest. That's all I am. That's all I should be. The words hung between them like a wall. Ernest realized with sickening clarity that he'd done this. He'd never told her she was more than that. Never made her feel like family. He'd let her exist in this impossible space, essential but invisible, saving his life while believing she was just doing her job. When are you leaving? He asked quietly. 2 weeks. She wiped her eyes. I'll stay through the transition. Help you find someone else. Ernest wanted to argue, to beg, to tell her she couldn't be replaced, but the words stuck in his throat, tangled up with 3 years of grief and guilt he didn't know how to voice, so he just nodded. Okay. Melinda's face crumpled for a moment before she turned away. I'll finish packing later. The girls need lunch. She walked past him, and Ernest let her go. He stood alone in her half-empty room, feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath him, and he had no idea how to stop it. The next morning, everything changed. Melinda came to work but kept her distance, professional, polite, careful not to get too close. She still did her job, made meals, cleaned, kept things running. But she didn't hum anymore, didn't sway while she worked, didn't move with that gentle rhythm the girls had learned to follow. And Ella and Lily felt it immediately. By afternoon, Lily had stopped using her new words. She stood at the living room window, rocking slightly, staring outside like she was waiting for something that wouldn't come. Ella retreated to the corner and began spinning, slow, repetitive circles she hadn't done in weeks. Ernest watched it happen in real time, watched his daughter slip backward into the silence they'd just escaped. That night, he found them both at the window again, still waiting. Lily's small hand pressed against the glass, and Ernest understood. They weren't waiting for something. They were waiting for someone. For Melinda. The woman who'd brought them back to life. The woman who was leaving in 2 weeks. And Ernest had just let her walk away without a fight. By the second day, Lily stopped eating. Ernest sat at the kitchen table watching his daughter push food around her plate without taking a single bite. She hadn't spoken since Melinda pulled away. Not a single word. Just silence and that constant staring out the window. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, the exact time Melinda used to start their sessions, both girls would go to the living room window and wait. They'd stand there for an hour, sometimes longer, just watching the driveway, waiting for her to come back. Ella had started rocking again, the repetitive motion she'd finally stopped weeks ago, back and forth, her eyes unfocused and distant. Ernest tried. God knows he tried. He put on Catherine's recordings, raised his arms the way Melinda had, moved slowly, gently, trying to remember everything he'd watched her do. But it didn't work. The girls wouldn't engage, wouldn't look at him. It was like they'd learned a language from Melinda that Ernest still couldn't speak, no matter how hard he tried. On the 3rd day, something happened that destroyed him. He found Ella in the living room trying to dance alone, her small arms raised toward the ceiling, her body swaying awkwardly, unsteadily. She was trying to recreate what Melinda had taught her, trying to hold onto it, but she couldn't sustain it. After a few moments, her arms dropped, her face crumpled, and tears, actual tears, rolled down her cheeks. Ernest hadn't seen his daughter cry in 3 years, not since before Catherine died. He moved toward her, but Ella turned away from him, pressed her face against the window, and kept crying silently, her small shoulders shaking. Ernest stood there helpless, watching his daughter grieve for someone who was still alive but might as well be gone. That night, after both girls finally fell asleep, Ernest went to his office. He sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about Dr. Morrison's threats, about Melinda's boxes packed upstairs, about his daughters standing at that window day after day. Then he did something he hadn't done since the night they first watched the videos. He opened Catherine's final recording, the one where she looked directly into the camera and spoke to him. Ernest, if something happens to me, don't let the girls stop moving. Movement is their language. Find someone who understands that. Don't let grief freeze them. Ernest had heard those words before, but this time they hit differently. Catherine hadn't just been talking about the girls. She'd been talking about him. For 3 years, he'd been frozen, buried in work, hiding from the house, avoiding connection because it hurt too much. And when someone finally came along who could unfreeze his daughters, who could unfreeze him, he'd let her believe she was nothing more than staff. He'd let grief make him blind. Ernest stared at his wife's face on the screen, and suddenly he understood what he had to do. Melinda was leaving in less than 2 weeks. His daughters were disappearing again. And if he didn't do something, if he didn't find the courage to say what he'd been too afraid to say, he was going to lose everything that mattered, not just for Ella and Lily, for himself. Because somewhere between watching Melinda dance with his daughters and seeing her pack her bags, Ernest had fallen in love with her, and he'd never told her. Ernest caught Melinda on her last day. She was loading the final box into her car when he pulled into the driveway. Behind her, through the living room window, he could see Ella and Lily standing in their usual spot, waiting, like they had every day at 3 o'clock for 2 weeks. Melinda. His voice stopped her mid-motion. She turned, her eyes red and tired. Mr. Anderson, Don't. He walked toward her, his heart pounding. Don't call me that, and don't leave, not yet, please. Ernest, we've been through this. I need to show you something. He gestured toward the house. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. She hesitated, then nodded. He led her inside, past the living room where the girls immediately perked up seeing Melinda, past the kitchen, down the hallway to the door that had been locked for 3 years. Catherine's music room. Ernest pulled out the key, his hand steady this time. I've been working on this every night for 2 weeks. He pushed the door open. Melinda gasped. The room was transformed, soft lighting, Catherine's sound system restored, and covering every wall, dozens of Ella's drawings. Every single one showed the same thing. 4 people holding hands, dancing, and above them, in the corner of each drawing, a blonde woman in a flowing dress, smiling down. Catherine, watching over them. This is where Catherine practiced, Ernest said quietly, where she danced when she was pregnant with the girls, where she planned to teach them someday. He turned to face Melinda fully. I locked this room for 3 years because I couldn't face it, but you've been unlocking everything I closed. Melinda's eyes filled with tears. Ernest took a breath. You're not just the maid, Melinda. You never were. You saved my daughters. You saved me. And I let you think you were nothing more than staff, because I was too afraid to admit what was really happening. Ernest, I'm in love with you. The words came out raw, honest. I don't know when it happened. Maybe the first time I saw you dance with them. Maybe when you sat with me while I watched Catherine's videos. But I can't let you walk out that door without telling you the truth. Melinda covered her mouth, tears streaming. I'm not asking you to stay as an employee, Ernest continued. I'm asking you to stay as family. Because that's what you are, to Ella and Lily. To me. From the hallway came a small voice. Melly? They both turned. Ella and Lily stood in the doorway, drawn by Melinda's presence. Ernest knelt down. Girls, come here. They moved slowly into the room, their eyes wide as they saw the drawings covering the walls. Lily pointed at one. We draw. You did, Ernest said gently, because you knew. You knew before I did. He looked at Melinda. Will you help me do this right? Help me honor Catherine by refusing to stay frozen? Melinda couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears falling freely. Ernest pressed play on Catherine's recordings. Her voice filled the room, the lullaby she used to sing. For a moment, everyone froze. Then slowly, Lily began to sway. Ella reached for Melinda's hand. Melinda took it, then reached for Ernest's. He grasped it like a lifeline. The 4 of them formed a circle in the center of Catherine's music room, and they began to move. Not perfect, not choreographed, just honest, real, present. Midway through the song, Lily stopped. Everyone held their breath. Then she spoke, clear and full. Mama singing, we dancing, Mama happy. Ernest's face crumpled. He dropped to his knees, and 3 years of held-back grief finally broke free. Both girls wrapped their arms around his neck without hesitation. Melinda knelt beside them, her hand on Ernest's shoulder. I miss her, Ernest choked out, the first time he'd said it aloud to his daughters. I miss her so much. Ella pressed her forehead to his. Didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. I know, me too. They stayed like that, holding each other in Catherine's room, surrounded by her voice, and for the first time in 3 years, grief didn't feel like drowning. It felt like release. When they finally stood, Ella took Ernest's hand. Lily took Melinda's. Then the girls joined their free hands, completing the circle. Again, Lily said softly. They danced, and when Ernest looked at Melinda across the circle, he saw not just the woman who saved his daughters. He saw the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. But there was still one question neither of them had answered out loud. Would Melinda stay? 6 months later, everything had changed. Ernest stood in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, watching through the window as Melinda taught the girls a new routine in the backyard. Spring had arrived in Denver, bringing warmth and color back to a house that had been frozen for too long. Ella and Lily were 7 now. Lily spoke in full sentences, over 200 words in her vocabulary. She asked questions, told stories, laughed freely. Ella communicated her own way, some words, mostly movement and gestures, and that was beautiful too. She didn't need to be like everyone else. She just needed to be seen. They weren't cured. Autism wasn't something that needed curing, but they were whole, connected, loved exactly as they were. Melinda had stayed, not in the guest wing as staff, but as part of the family. The girls called her Melly, and every afternoon at 3 o'clock, they still gathered in Catherine's music room to dance, not because they had to, because they wanted to. Ernest joined them now, not leading, just present. He'd learned to parent on his daughter's terms, to communicate through patience instead of pressure, to see their autism not as a tragedy, but as a different way of experiencing the world. That afternoon, as music drifted through the open windows and the girls spun barefoot in the grass, Ernest walked outside. Melinda noticed him and smiled, the kind of smile that still made his chest tighten. She left the girls chasing butterflies and sat beside him on the porch steps. "Do you ever regret it?" Ernest asked quietly. "Staying here? Giving up Philadelphia?" Melinda watched Ella and Lily dancing in the sunlight, their laughter carrying on the breeze. She thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, burned out, broken, convinced she'd failed everyone she tried to help. Then she looked at these 2 extraordinary girls who'd taught her that healing wasn't linear. That connection didn't require perfection, that love could exist in silence and movement and patient presence. "I didn't give up anything," she said softly. "I found everything." Ernest took her hand. "These girls taught me something too, that I can't control everything, that sometimes the best thing I can do is just show up." "And you do," Melinda said, "every single day." From across the yard, Lily called out, "Daddy, Melly, come dance." Ernest and Melinda stood. As they walked toward the girls, Ella ran up and grabbed both their hands, pulling them into a circle. Catherine's old music played from the speaker Ernest had brought outside. And there, in the backyard where grief had once made everything gray, 4 people danced together. Not perfect, not choreographed, just real. Ernest looked at Melinda, and she looked back. In her eyes, he saw the future, messy and beautiful and full of grace. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, Ernest found the photo Melinda had taken that afternoon. All 4 of them mid-spin, arms raised, faces bright with joy. He placed it on the mantel beside Catherine's portrait. 2 images, 2 chapters of love, both true, both sacred. Beneath the new photo, Ella had written in careful letters, "We dance, we love, we family." Ernest traced the words with his finger. For 3 years he'd believed healing meant forgetting, that moving forward meant leaving Catherine behind. But his daughters had taught him something better. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant transforming pain into presence. It meant honoring what was lost by choosing to fully live. Catherine's voice would always be part of their story. Her love hadn't ended when she died. It had just learned new steps. And standing in his living room, looking at the 2 portraits side by side, Ernest understood what God had been whispering all along. Love doesn't replace love. It multiplies. Grace doesn't erase grief. It walks beside it. And sometimes the miracle you're praying for doesn't look like what you expected. Sometimes it shows up wearing an apron, speaking a language you forgot existed, and teaching you that the way back to life isn't through fixing what's broken, it's through learning to dance again. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and gentle, like the rain that had fallen the day Catherine died. But inside, there was only warmth, only music, only the sound of a family that had learned to breathe again. And in that Denver home, beneath a sky that had seen so much sorrow, healing danced on. Barefoot, imperfect, and beautifully, beautifully real.